think we should get started. Nuri, welcome everyone. My name is Cecilia Dom. I'm the principal investigator of the CDS Lab Research Coordination Network funded by the National Science Foundation. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, and Nuri Gutierrez is our coordinator for the event for this webinar. Nuri, would you like to introduce our speaker, David Baxter, today?
Yes, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. So as Cecilia said, we are in the second part series on infrastructure financing for few. And for those who are here for the first time, the Research Coordination Network is a project studying food, energy, and water nexus in urban environments, focusing on the concept of the CTS Lab. So today, I'm very glad to introduce David Baxter, who kindly joined us to talk about the concept, principles, challenges, evolutions, and ideas of around the people first public and private partnerships approach. Mr. Baxter is originally from South Africa and lives now in the United States. He's currently a senior advisor to the International Sustainable Resilience Center for Public and Private Partnerships in New Orleans and a steering committee member of WAPPP. In addition, he is a freelance international development and public and private partnership consultant. He has provided capacity building programs and infrastructure consulting services to over 40 international clients and business partners located in Africa, North and Central America, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. Many client projects were sponsored by development donor agencies, including USA, MCC, ADB, the Dutch Foreign Ministry, the African Development Bank, and the World Bank. He has also led alliance building initiatives with institutions that have included the UNICE PPP Center of Excellence in Geneva, the Institute of Mexico, the African Development Bank, the PPC Center of Excellence in Istanbul, Turkey, the Monterrey Institute in Mexico, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. Mr. Baxter holds a bachelor's degree in political geography and history and a master's degree in economic geography from the University of Stellenbosch. With that, I give the room to David. Thank you very much, David, for participating today.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Research Coordination Network for inviting me. And it's always exciting to talk about public-private partnerships, especially the new generation, which is evolving, and that's the people first public-private partnerships. Just to mention that WAPPP stands for the World Association of PPP Units and Practitioners or Professionals, and it's an organization that focuses on advancing PPPs globally. I am going to, if all goes well, move to the next slide. Here we are. So I want to talk about people first public-private private partnerships, or PFPPPs. Generally, when we're talking about PPPs, I'm talking about structured PPPs, where there's an agreement between the public and the private sector to provide a service or to build certain infrastructure. Over the last few years, there's a greater and increasing understanding that PPPs need to also focus on introducing an element of people into the public-private partnerships, which typically have been done. So PFPPPs, I'll just talk about PPPs in the sense now it's easier to say, but you'll understand that I mean people first public-private partnerships, is designed to help countries achieve the sustainable development goals that they are striving for. And these have changed dramatically in the last year, especially due to the international pandemic. And we find a situation now that there's a real revisiting of priorities, types of projects, etc., that would be done as PPPs, because we have limited resources, there's increasing need, and people need to be helped out. And so one of the reasons we've looked at PFPPPs, it's an enhanced approach to help overcome many of the weaknesses of the traditional PPPs that have been implemented globally. These projects are typically, there are two types, where the government pay PPPs, where they are funded by taxpayers and concessionaires, or they can also be run totally independently as a project that's paid by users. What is important, though, is we want to focus more and more on the value for people. And so this concept is being introduced as UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, based in Geneva, states, is that they say the following, that the concept is critically important to focus on PPPs delivering desirable and necessary outcomes from infrastructure investment that focuses PPPs on delivering value for people. The initiative started at the UNECE, International PPP Center of Excellence in Geneva. And for those who are further interested, if you just Googled UNECE and then you did promoting people first PPPs, you'll get to the first image at the top of the page, where it tells you a lot of information, or provides a lot of information on people involved, people are interested in PPPs. So as you can see, there are about 493 contributing experts around the world have been working on it. There are standards that are being involved. For those who are really interested in finding out a bit more about it, there are, examples of these type of projects. And then there's also 7 centers of international excellence, which are supporting UNECE in its mission. The one that I belong to is the International Sustainable Resilience Institute, which is focused on sustainable and resilient PPPs. We are associated with this initiative of UNECE, and you can also see that's the front page that I've captured of our website, but you can see that we are very, very much focused on people first PPPs as well. So David Dodd, who founded the center, was working with the original committees at UNECE. I got involved about 1.5 years after it was into it, and we've been working further. The World Association of PPP Units and Professionals is also part of this initiative. And I would say that most of our leadership and members, our leadership team are very active in trying to promote people first PPPs through WAPPP. Go to the next slide. So what are some of the outcomes that we are looking at when we look at people first PPPs? And there here you can see, which is important. And I think these are all ideas that resonate, with most countries at the moment, and also resonate very heavily with, countries that are faced with challenges caused by the pandemic, and which will be faced by challenges caused by future events, such as, climate change, terrible adverse natural events, etc. And I think even, in the United States now, as we have a change in administration, I think there's going to be a greater interest in doing projects that are going to uplift the citizens of not only the United States, but economies and countries around the world. So the 5 people outcome concepts that I can, that they're looked for is an increasing access to essential services and to lessen social inequality and justice. So we're not just doing PPP projects because we can, we're not just building roads because we can, or sports centers, or whatever. We are really going to build projects that will help lessen social inequality and injustice. The other is also to enhance resilience and responsibility towards environmental sustainability. So many projects around the world, whether they be PPP projects or just traditional construction projects or procurements, have not always focused on resilience and responsibility. And so we have to look forward, we can call it future-proofing if we want to call it, of projects that will ensure that these projects last, do well, don't impact the environment unnecessarily, and help improve the world we live in and the built world that we live in. They also are focused on improving economic effectiveness and sustainability, which is critically important. Now, one thing that's important is we're also trying to develop a paradigm of practices and thoughts and the philosophy, if you want to call it, that will promote a process that is replicable and can also lead to the development of future projects. And you'll see some in a short while, some of the examples that are giving, but we are very much focused on building capacity of governments to understand what people first projects are, and also helping them to move forward and implement the projects because they've received the necessary training and knowledge to do similar projects. And then also to fully involve all stakeholders, typically in a structured contractual PPP project, which would be there to build infrastructure or to provide a service through a contractual concessionary process. The focus is on, when you talk about the actual partners, you're talking about the companies that are involved in this agreement that are running the project company or the special purpose vehicle as it's called. But we also have the situation that we have stakeholders where which represent the broader community. They can represent civil society, they can represent other government agencies, etc. And so the great focus here is to involve as many stakeholders as we can so that you can get a greater understanding of what is happening and also integrate special interest groups who've played a limited role in the past. As we move on, there are a number of principles that also guide the PPPs. And all these principles that I'm showing and the guidelines, etc., can be found on the document site for UNECE. But the principles there, and there are 10 of them, is to build infrastructure strategies that make sure that people's needs are listened to. I like number 2 specifically, deliver more, better, simpler projects. The other is increasing official skills and delivering people first projects. You cannot do these projects in a vacuum. So unless the public sector is well informed, as well as the private sector, you are going to have a challenge. It's also important that if you are going to implement people first PPPs, that you too take into consideration policy and the legal frameworks. By this, I mean the laws, the regulations, the guidelines, and these need to be built into the procurements that take place. And especially, where you should allow the active engagement of the communities that are going to be impacted, but also have a zero, and we feel very strongly about this, zero tolerance approach towards corruption, because corruption takes away a lot of the benefit of projects. It wastes resources, and it definitely is going to be focused on specific interest groups. Another important aspect is also disclosing more information about projects. So don't just announce the project, build it, and then say it's none of your business. We really want to ensure that the society that's being impacted or the community understands what is happening. We also want to de-risk projects. And by this, we mean that, if there's risks, we need to identify what they are, and we need to understand what strategies we can put in place which allow predictability in the enabling environment. There's also focus on setting out the project selection criteria to promote value for people. And so in most times in the past, there was an element of a focus on value for money in PPPs. It wasn't just about the money, but what value were you going to get out of it on the money spent. They've elevated it and leveraged it to value for people. So what are you going to get out from people's sense? And another element that's also being introduced is value for the future. So we're not saying undo value for money. We're saying leverage the opportunities of value for people, value for money, by introducing value for people and value for the future. Environmental sustainability is critically important. Also looking at financing in ways that are sensitive to people first. So there's green bonds, venture capital, all sorts of elements that can be introduced. And then also we want to avoid death traps. Now, PPPs have got a bad rap in the past for those that weren't well structured or well thought out. This is not a process where we want to indebt the public sector to the private sector. So definitely we're working against this perception that exists often that PPPs result in privatization of profit and nationalization of debt. That is one of the principles that we are particularly working to ensure that this doesn't happen. There are standards that are needed. It's great to have an idea, it's great to have a practice, but there's also need to have standards that can be introduced, which guide the process. And so the People First PPP standards reflect international best practices. These vast amount of people at UNEC, at WAPPP, as well as ISRC that have collaborated and put these ideas together have definitely looked at international best practices that form the policy documents guiding governments. We want to replicate best practices on a global scale. And so this is critically important. And currently standards are being developed and evolved by UNSCE and its partners to ensure that these standards are written, are understood, and are available as guiding documents. We want to also help the Sustainable Development Goal achievement take place. So the UNEC International Center of Excellence, and I should have added there for PPPs, is bringing together expertise to bring standards together, to develop standards and to champion them through champions, people that are interested, and a broader range of stakeholders. We do have, there's a website that you can go to. I know it's difficult to write these down when you're viewing it, but if you just did UNECE PPP, as you can see there, or you did People First and UNECE, you will get to this website where many of the references that I'm making are coming from. It's important also to be able to measure quantitatively, essentially, what is happening with your projects and whether they are really people first projects. So there's a draft process undergo at the moment to develop what they're calling a people first impact assessment tool. And the tool will consist of a self-assessment and a certification scheme. So if you are developing a project and you want to ensure that it is meeting the principles of People First PPPs, there's a self-assessment process that you'll be able to go through. And you can see this also on the website, the process that's being made. And then once you have done your evaluation, you would be able to get a certification from from UNECE that your project really is a People First PPP. So there are benchmarks and evaluation criteria that have been developed. There's a weighting and ranking of these outcomes that takes place in the model that's being evolved, or the tool, sorry, and then a scoring system. And benchmark and evaluation criteria are grouped under each of the 5 outcomes that are desired. So there's access and equity. So there are 22 of them. Economic effectiveness and fiscal sustainability, there are 25 of them. Environmental sustainability and resilience, 28, replicability, 10, and stakeholder engagement, there are 19. So you'll be able to go through this exercise and check and give yourself a score for each of those. And then there are threshold scores, which help you decide my project is actually leaning towards people first, or we have to do other things because we're not quite reaching the grade yet. And then the certificational validation scheme will assess the compliance of projects with the UN SDGs. This is voluntary, obviously, no one's being forced to do this. But if you are committed, and if your government says it's committed, or your institution says it's committed, it'd be good to go through the certification process, because then you can give proof that you have actually met the goals, the objectives, and the intent of People First PPPs. Just to give you a sense, you can go to the website. As I said, case study is always important. People would like to understand. I captured this from the site, but each of these blocks that you see, if you click on them, they will give you access to projects on these different which are topics, as you can see. So it goes from the things that we're used to, like smart and sustainable cities, to resilient infrastructure. One which is becoming increasingly important, and I'll talk about that later on, is information technology. And we have, transportation, which is a typical type of PPP, but we also have agriculture and regional development, health and education. And health and education, particularly now in the post-COVID world, are critically important. So I think you would find these case studies very, very interesting. They are evolving concepts, so I touched on this briefly, and that was taking the value of money, but introducing the value for money idea, and introducing a focus on value for people and a value for the future. And I would say before conventional, if you want to call them PPP practitioners or proponents, just dismiss the approach, it is critically important to understand that PPPs do not call for the replacement of value for money, as I've said, but are calling for additional assessments and considerations. And this, in effect, is an expanding strategy to mitigate future impacts for PPPs. Because you can think, if you look at value for money, you've got to understand the proposition behind it, the model, the financial model, the expectations and deliverables. But when you add value for people and you add value for the future, you're definitely elevating it to a level where we are now becoming more concerned about sustainability, resilience, adaptation, all those elements that people are talking a lot about. And I think what is most important, we're looking at ways to future-proof projects. Those who are unfamiliar with PPPs, with traditional ones, these projects tend to be concessional agreements or agreements between the public and private sector to build something or to provide a service, and they can extend over 20 to 30 years. There are even cases here in Virginia, where I live, of a project that was done for 99 years. So you can imagine the future risks, the challenges, and if you don't look at this, then you are going to face challenges because these projects could fail. And the worst thing you want to have is a failed PPP project to disappoint stakeholders. It causes financial stress. It can be embarrassment to public officials, and that's the last thing that you want to happen. I've been collaborating with a very good friend of mine, Dr. Peñalva, who is associated with the International Center for Numerical Methods and Engineering in Barcelona. And the focus there, and that's with SIMNI, his organization and Senate, is to try and find or to develop a model that looks at the value for people and value for future ideas and tries to quantitate them or provide a quantification. And you can see here that basically value for people and value for money inform us on whether the socioeconomic value provided by the proposed infrastructure financing is balanced with regards to the different impacts that can occur. The other is it also is a detailed and analytical approach where there are matrices, and they've developed with the IREM model, and you can reach out to Dr. Peñalva as well as Professor Turo, who's been a collaborator on this effort as well, to develop a process where you can look at the project proposal, you can do evaluations, as you can see in this diagram very briefly. You can provide estimations in terms of value for money, so they're not skipping value for money, it's still there. You can do an assessment of financial sustainability, assessment of the concerns of local communities, so that's the stakeholder outreach. Then you can also analyze the long-term effects, and then you start looking at how we can also add value for future, because when you're looking at the long term, you're also very much focused on value for the future. And this is an element that they have heavily focused on, is the value for future element. So what are we going to get out of this project in the next 20, 30, 40 years, depending on the duration of the concession? For those of you who use LinkedIn, you can find Domingo Peñalva on LinkedIn. And he's an expert, in value for people and value for the future. And he's working on a publication that's relatively fresh. I think you can request it from him. And that's Infrastructure Projects Evaluation, Putting People First, a Necessary Move in Public Investment Appraisal. And this project, these documents are creating a body of knowledge, a body of practice, and an approach to ensure that people first PPPs become more efficient and more effective. People are always interested in real life projects. At the ISRC, or the International Sustainable Resilience Center, we have launched a project called the Imago Project. I put the website, you can see it there at imagoresilience.com. And I've put the first page there, as you can see the black block to the top right-hand side of the screen. And this project is looking at digital resilience through broadband infrastructure via people first. And our focus is to lead to the digital transformation of SMEs. SMEs have struggled, particularly around the world, because of the impacts of the pandemic. They have lost access to businesses or to people. They've with quarantines, etc., and they've had to find ways to commercialize to take their commercial activities to a digital platform. This has been easy for very large companies around the world because they've had it. You can think of Amazon, didn't really have to create a platform, it had it already. But there has been a general flow of many people towards these very large platforms to the detriment of smaller businesses because people are not visiting them anymore. But in countries around the world, there is a situation that once you leave the largest cities and you go into the peri-urban or rural areas, access to broadband disappears, access to just the internet as such doesn't exist. Yesterday, I even had a conversation with somebody in Mexico who had to use the old telephone conferencing system because they just don't have this sort of access. So it's great to say, let's have a commercial platform for selling projects. Let's do Zoom. Let's do, the different types of platforms exist. Well, it doesn't work in these areas. So what we're doing with this project, which is going to take place in Mexico, is basically looking at a digital assessment for small and medium enterprises. We're looking at a scalable digital transformation model. It's fine to develop the infrastructure, the model, but if these businesses don't have the understanding or approach, we're looking at training for these business owners, many who are women entrepreneurs who run home businesses and don't have access to their typical markets anymore, a vendor ecosystem development approach, and then the platform. But we also want to, as part of the project, look at ways we can improve digital skill development, building business resilience, economic development. And you can see where this ties into the people first aspect, where we said that people first PPPs would be a way for governments to use PPPs as a tool for economic development, but also for achieving their country's sustainable development goals. And then the infrastructure, there's going to be an element of digital infrastructure on this project, and that is to bring the linkages to communities that have been ignored or do not have access. And then replicability. The model we're evolving and the model we are developing is definitely going to focus on being able to be replicated in many other countries. I'm particularly excited and interested about finding ways to replicate it in Africa, as many of you heard from where I originally come from. It's interesting in a country even like South Africa, my home country, that you can live in a city and you think you could be anywhere in the world. You could be in Europe and United States, but you go 30, 40 miles outside the city and there's just not access to the infrastructure or the digital infrastructure, which is going to enable communities to grow and to succeed and to be better in the future, and also to help them become future-proofed, especially for businesses. Just a broad overview of this project, you can see will be launched in Mexico in 2021. It's been endorsed by the Mexican Secretary of Economic Development, and it has two complementary elements: Imago, which is the platform for improving access and understanding of digital infrastructure and how you can use platforms for commercial purposes, and then the actual PPP project, which is going to focus on introducing broadband infrastructure. We'll be setting up a special purpose vehicle or project company to implement it. And then the part 2 element, as you can see there, which is a 12-month digital transformation project. And this will be basically introducing small and medium businesses or enterprises to digital, or completing a digital assessment, finding out what their needs, the platforms, implementation. And then, as I said, the model that is evolving can be refined for worldwide replication. If you are interested in this, you can always reach out to us because we are looking for partners to carry this forward. So I think I have reached my half an hour, but I think this is a good time for question and answers. I am going to try and stop sharing my screen so that we can have access to faces, and hopefully there'll be questions and a conversation as we move forward through the rest of the time that's left over. But please do consider doing some investigation to people first PPPs. PPPs are definitely not dead. Many people say the pandemic killed them. I don't think that the pandemic killed them. I just think the pandemic refocused them and will continue to refocus them. So we will continue to look for different models of PPPs, different approaches, different innovations that are to the advantage of all those who are impacted by them. So I'm back. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It was a great presentation. We have a few questions and comments. I will call the names, and if everyone can please, before talking, unmute yourself. Professor Hilary Brown.
Yeah, I'm looking for my question. Just a second. Basically, in the US, as far as I know from my very scant knowledge of this, many cities and states really lack any experience, technical capacity, or expertise to even consider public-private partnerships, and may even require certain enabling legislation. So that leaves me with the question is, where do you start if that's the case?
Yeah, no, that's true. You know, it's almost shameful or an embarrassment in a way when I travel around the world, and you know, countries always say to me, "Give us USA examples." You know, you're telling us how to or what to do, and then you hear people saying, "Well, you know." What do they do in the United States? And we have to say that we don't have a national approach. We don't have a national policy. And I think that's partly due to our federal structure. There is the Build Better Bureau that exists or at the Department of Transportation, which I would say is the closest to a national center for PPPs across the whole of the United States. Obviously, it focuses on transportation and not others. But at certain states, Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I live in, they have a very robust PPP practice. California does as well. But you're correct, it's fragmented and it, you know, is very much exploratory. I'm hoping that under the new administration, there will be an understanding that PPPs can be a tool for bringing the innovation and the resources of both the public and private sector together. But I think one of the first things that has to happen is we have to do a very strong, how would you put, education of politicians and political leadership, because you know, I'm concerned that when they hear people first, they might think it's socialism or something like that. And this is definitely not what we're calling for. We're just calling for a way to do PPPs better and to elevate them. And who could be against the idea that we want to have PPP projects that are future-proofed and that are more sustainable and resilient? But there is much to be done. And this is part of the initiative that we are working on. The ISRC, where I work, is very much focused on getting that message out. And we are looking for partners, but it's going to have to take place at national level. It's going to have to take place at state level, as well as local government and municipal level. And, you know, pretty much maybe like the new president is doing is, you know, harmonizing and coming up with a national strategy for, you know, the COVID response. There's a need to do this for infrastructure, and he has the opportunity. So I hope that was a bit of an answer to your question.
Thank you very much. A little quick follow-up on that. I've heard that there's something called the public-private partnership units that have been successfully used in other countries to overcome some of the challenges.
Thanks for asking about it. So WAPPP, that I'm a steering committee member, is, as I said, stands for the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. So you will find in almost every other country around the world that has a serious PPP program, they have PPP units, which are government, institutions that are located in either the treasury of a country or in the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Infrastructure. And their purpose is to help with the development of guidance and practice, also to develop the national policy, the national priorities, and if they're doing their job well, also to help subnational government entities, the ministries, provincial governments, city governments, etc., implement PPPs. So there are countries that have done amazing efforts to do this. One country that I've been involved in is in Saudi Arabia, where they've set up under the, their whole national transition program, a very, very strong active PPP unit. Another PPP unit or leadership group, if you want to call it, it's not really called a PPP unit, but it's part of it, is in the Netherlands, where they have in the Dutch government's agency called the Rijkswaterstaat, which is the closest that I come to his understanding is the Army Corps of Engineers type of institution, where they have become world leaders in policy, guidance, practice. And in the United Nations, the World Bank has also promoted these institutions across the world. I would say that, it's good to find platforms where you can share ideas and where you can have a debate. And I would say it's critically important, as you said correctly, to look at what these PPP units are doing, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we can learn from the mistakes and challenges and adopt best practices. And you will find, I think, over time, because of WAPP's influence and outreach, that many of these PPP units are now going to be focused a bit on PPPs or people first PPPs as well.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Mike Burnett.
Yeah, my experience has mainly been in Europe, where for 15 years I ran the European PPP Forum for the European Institute of Public Administration. My experience is that PPP is a mechanism and it's not an outcome. So I guess the important thing about this initiative is that it broadens the objectives of PPP and other infrastructure schemes to include innovation, environmental and sustainability criteria, as well as financial criteria, and also broadens the stakeholders who are involved. I guess that's what I picked up from following Dave, from being connected with David on LinkedIn.
Thank you. I think you summarized it very succinctly instead of the way that I did it. But it's true. I think in the past, and I'm not a naive person or sarcastic, but I think a lot of times PPPs were done just because they could be done. Okay, or it was a convenient way to do it, or sometimes PPPs were done which should never have been done. It was crazy. Why did they do it? And I think this introduces a new rigor to the screening criteria, if you can call it that, to ensure that we are doing PPPs for reasons that are not only good, but make sense, as you said, from a financial perspective. From a people perspective, why would you build a road that people aren't going to use? I mean, it's destined for failure from a financial perspective. Or, if governments have contracts with their citizens, social contracts with their citizens, and they say they're going to provide healthcare, but they don't have, the funding. There's a funding gap, and they need 10 hospitals, but they can only build 5. Why not reach out to the private sector to use the private sector to fill the gap and build the other 5? But it's not only in the sense of political, it's not only in the sense of practical. I think it's also in the sense that the private sector needs to understand this. And I believe that, in the next 2 to 3 years, as countries really focus on economic recovery from the pandemic, they're going to reprioritize their projects, and they are going to choose projects that are critically important for their survival. And that's definitely going to include things like, healthcare PPPs, and that fits in with the idea of people first. It's going to include education PPPs, because everyone has struggled. I think the digital transformation that the world has gone through in the last year is going to be dramatic, and this is also going to result in tremendous changes. But again, you know, the question we ask ourselves, are we just doing them because we can, or are we doing it with a broader objective? And putting people into it, I don't think, people into the equation, and including the idea of people first and value for the future is not a bad idea. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have a question from Professor Michael Baxter.
Hi, thank you, David, for a really interesting talk. It opens up a lot of perspectives. Early in your slides, you indicated two types of PPEs. One basically government finance, tax financed, and the other concessions, which I interpret as largely as privatizations of public services often. Wide history of that, often unsuccessful from a social policy perspective, but useful to cities. My question is whether there's a third form that might be distinguished in which the project involves a large amount of private capital, but the delivery of service remains public. Something like what you were suggesting in the hospital example you just mentioned, such that, you know, the private capital is utilized, terms are arranged for it that make it feasible, but the government remains in the driver's seat in terms of providing for the needs of people and engaging stakeholders and so forth.
That's really good, and you know, thanks for bringing that up. There is, you know, the whole idea of subsidies, you know, or availability fees, as they call it, and approaches along those lines, which are a little bit risky in the sense that, you know, this is very much dependent on the government's revenues and taxes that it can generate to pay for the service. And then you have, you know, the user paying for the service, but that is controversial as well when it comes to healthcare, for example, because what do you do if the sick person can't afford the fee? You know, do you turn them away and they don't get the service that's been provided? And so you need a balanced approach and a hybrid approach. And it's very difficult to say that there are specific PPP models. You know, people always, when governments have asked me, David, can you give us the PPP model that we can use for all projects? I would say that every single project is unique. And so, you know, when people try and call them, you know, DBFOM, or, you know, there's, once I set up a list, I think I came up to about 60 different types of descriptions for PPP projects. And it pointed out, you know, emphatically that every project is different and it doesn't fit a specific, you know, you can't cram it or hit it into a certain mold. So we have to be creative. You know, I think hybrid PPPs, if you've not read about that, have a look. Those are coming up and becoming more common. But talk about the example. I can give you an example of in Turkey. The government came up with a system where the infrastructure and the supporting facilities were built by the concessionaire, private sector, but the people who worked in the hospital still you know, were government employees. So they did have a control over it. And the payments for that was paid through the National Pension Fund. So it worked well for the private sector because they were going to be guaranteed that there would be payment for the infrastructure that they built and the operation and maintenance of the infrastructure, because there'd be revenue through the government pension fund. But the government also maintained control because the people who were working in the hospital would be government employees. And so I think that's an example, and I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
The next question is from John Sellers. John?
Yeah, David, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
David, you and I have been communicating a little bit through LinkedIn. Just by background, I'm with Yavapai Regional Capital, which is named partially after an Indian tribe. And after 30 years of working in project finance internationally with names you'll recognize, such as Paribas, and doing some real firsts in P3s in various countries. We did the first BOT in Turkey, for instance, against all the odds when the World Bank said it couldn't be done. And I learned that the first transaction in a country is always the most difficult. Doesn't matter whether it's Colombia, even France, where we did the Metro de Rouen. So when I moved back here and actually retired, I eventually got back into infrastructure because of the invitation from my local mayor. We put YRC together, and we did it much as you've suggested, initially drawn by inspiration from people you know, like Adrian Montague, who set up the UK effort, public-private partnerships, British Columbia, and it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is for a very simple reason, which is that you talk about imparting knowledge to public officials. I ran the RFP for one of the first PPPs about 10 years ago for 2 cities adjacent to each other in Arizona. They didn't want to hear what the city next door was telling them, never mind somebody from Washington or even the state capital. Yeah. And I know this gets into a very broad issue, and frankly, we almost gave up at Yavapai Regional Capital about 6 months ago, but we've restarted because of, well, the hope that the US will eventually get it right. But the US is unique, and I say that from having done deals in 30 countries and living in this for 10 years in the trenches. There is no country as balkanized as the United States. So my question, and as you probably know, there are people talking about, you know, Norman Anderson's talking about using the state infrastructure banks, which I see. The problem there is that the state infrastructure banks don't do anything for a project like I-15, which is screaming out for regional cooperation, not competition. So my question to you is, if you see anything coming from Washington that smacks of Washington-centric, and I have my own views on the IFC, how do you make it work in this country? How do you make that work? Just one last thing. I was on a conference call this morning with some old friends from Alan Novery, and I've been far from the ivory towers of project finance, but listening to the conversation, it was fascinating. I found myself drifting into the ivory tower mentality, even by being on the phone with them, because you naturally get that way. That's not the way P3s, in my view, are going to get done. How do you, so let's get back to a question. How do you overcome that by setting something up in Washington?
Yeah. Thank you. That's quite a long question. In the, you know, typically every year there was what they called the Infrastructure Week that took place here in DC, and unfortunately under the past administration that didn't happen or was very ineffective. But what it did was bring the public and the private sector together around a common table where they could talk about infrastructure needs and ways to deliver. You're quite correct in saying that, you know, when most cities, local governments, you know, county governments, states or whatever start projects, they've never done one before, and they have no knowledge of what PPPs are about. They also can be a little bit prideful, and I mean that in the best sense that, you know, no one else is going to tell us what to do. But I think what can be done is, you know, at these forums that hopefully will reinvigorate themselves and become effective platforms for discussion, is that the public sector will take a chance to listen to the private sector, especially companies that have done these projects in other countries and have the insights and the knowledge. You know, if I was ever going to launch a PPP project, if I was the mayor of a city, whatever, I definitely would want to find a company that has done 4 or 5 of them elsewhere. The question is, can you do these projects without an enabling environment, without a legal framework? You can. It just depends if, you know, how the approach that's done, if there's a bit of education. And one thing that people don't realize that in Turkey, for example, which has one of the most active and largest PPP programs in the world, there is no national enabling what you call it environment. It's done by very well, how would you call it, thoughtful leadership of certain ministries and government.
The Treasury.
And the Treasury, yes. which have said, well, we don't have this guidance, but we need to do it and we want to do it. So let's go ahead and do it. And so I can see, the Build America Bureau, who I know some very, very, very skilled people there, who have actually brought together practitioners into leadership from different states, which had very active programs, especially, Virginia. I'm pretty proud of that, in the sense that I think the Virginian PPP unit is like the gold standard possibly for PPPs in the United States, have brought them together. And they are starting a very active program. Obviously, it's voluntary because you can't force states or anyone to participate, but a voluntary a program at least to educate people and improve people's understanding so that they can at least improve the capacity of their institutions. But it will take strong leadership from the new administration. And I think what's going to be important is, that, there's the sense that the past administration was very pro-government at the expense of the people. And now there's a sense maybe that the new administration will be pro-people at the expense of the private sector. We definitely need a situation, if you're looking at people first PPPs, is these are equal partnerships and trusting where both parties listen to one another. So they need to have outreach, market outreach, understandings, and that, because if local governments or subnational governments don't do that in the United States, it's going to be to their detriment. It makes absolutely no sense. And so it's people like you and me, the organizations we belong to, and forums or opportunities like this to discuss that can hopefully persuade the naysayers or those who think they know what they're doing but don't.
If I make an observation there, and I made my first trip to Washington representing YRC on November the 19th, 2008, when change you could believe in inspired us to make regular trips, including some of those conferences.
Yeah.
The problem is the people with the projects simply don't turn up. It's two different worlds. They don't, you have to be out in the field to be able to deal with these people and be in their offices.
Yeah.
It scares them. A suit scares them.
Yeah, I know. Well, we can just wish and hope. And yeah.
Okay, we thank you all for. We have many more people on the line. I have a list here, and I would like to try to give everyone the chance to speak. So we have now next Kimani Godman. Kimani.
Hello. Hi, I'm actually calling in from Geneva, but I'm originally actually from the Caribbean. I specialize in investment and intellectual property. And I noticed that earlier, the presentation that was given, the gentleman was speaking about when you move outside of in certain countries, outside of certain cities, about the infrastructure, telecommunication, etc. And coming from although I don't live there anymore, but coming from a small Caribbean island and having worked for government in public-private partnerships, mostly in the tourism industry, I've seen that when you come from small islands like these, digital infrastructure is not a problem. And you often get wholesale PPP designed systems that are designed for developing countries that don't resemble their policy issues, don't resemble those of smaller countries. So you get projects that don't really meet the needs of these countries, really.
No, and that's true. I think a lot of decision making, a lot of planning, and a lot of project delivery takes place in a vacuum. And I think this is, one of the concepts that we're really focusing heavily on in PPPs, that you need to break that cycle of ignoring people and trying to deliver what they need. And it just makes sense. If you want to have a successful PPP that's going to rely on its existence by people using it, do it on projects or apply it to projects that people are actually going to be excited and want to be part of. Don't have these, sort of firewalls or social firewalls that prevent people from being involved and not listening. Some of the countries that have been the most successful in PPP implementation are those who have done market sounding activities, where they've reached out to the private sector and asked them, what are you interested in providing? How can you do it? How can you help us do it better? And then they get good partners. I think it's also not a bad idea to just add, another element of this and reach out to people and find out what they want. To me, it just makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have now Mark Ifil. Mark?
Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask my question. Quickly, I guess it kind of ties in with what the young lady spoke about earlier, but I kind of like to keep things as simple as possible. And by the way, I'm from a small island. I live there. I also work in the government here, and I also work on several public-private partnerships, some of which work well and some of which leave a little to be desired. But I think fundamentally what I would like to know is if there's a specific focus on making more daily tasks easier or more convenient to execute. And like I said, I like to put things simply. So rather than talk about terms like innovation and all that jazz, at the end of the day, as far as I know, everybody in the world has tasks they have to do every day. So if there are ways we can make those daily tasks easier or more convenient to execute or accomplish, regardless of where you are, what continent or whatever, the task would, of course, be specific to where you're from, your culture, your country, your continent, or what have you. But if we can, I'm just asking if there's a specific focus on, finding ways to make daily tasks or completing daily tasks as easy or as convenient as possible. That's my question.
Yes, it's the practicality of best practice, I suppose, is what you're referring to. And, it's good to have these ideas and to, be excited about them, but then how do you get them across to people? How do you implement them better? We are looking at that at the Imago project that we're working on, and that is to, develop something that's replicable by learning lessons and understanding what people want. I know in countries like Uganda, where they've initiated similar projects, they have spent a lot of time with the enablers, the people who are responsible for the project, sitting down and talking to them and understanding, or ensuring that they understand the same language, understand the outcomes, understand the practical implications and how to do it. So, this is going to be part of the ongoing debate, but whether it's happening or not in certain countries, it is absolutely critical that this process takes place. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have next Sagar Sumaria. Sorry if I didn't pronounce well your name. Sagar?
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. Hi, David. Thanks very much for today, and thank you for the opportunity to ask my question. I come from London, UK, and I remember first hearing about PPPs when Tony Blair came into power in the 90s. And then we saw for the next 20 years the slow creeping privatization of our NHS system. My question is with regards to tax contributions, and fair tax contributions is a majorly big anomaly in countries where people are talking about sustainability. I always find it surprising that people talk about sustainability and where we're going to get the funds from, but no one's actually talking about where are the tax contributions that me and every other person in the UK has paid as a taxpayer to the organizations and our governments who are the public servants. So someone was mentioning earlier about social contracts. My understanding is that there is no social contract between me as a public and the council, because the council is my public servant. So where is my tax contributions going, and where are these companies who are not paying fair tax, of which I've just read a report saying something like so many offshore funds have investments in 74% of PPPs. And if those tax contributions were fairly made, just like I am probably going to have to file at the end of January, then we wouldn't really have to look for extra funding or seed funding. Question, very clear aspect, is with regards to everyone's talking about sustainability. You mentioned about roads. What's happening in India, what's happening in Africa, is the resources that are taken from the global south, which people are saying divest from coal. We are reinvesting that divestment from coal. We're putting it back into similar mineral extraction, which is for the lithium, the cobalt, and everything else. So the sustainability side is not really sustainable because it's still reliant on extraction of resources from the global south. And again, it's conflated with tax evasion and philanthropy as well. But those are the two questions with regards to tax contributions and fair tax, which as a member of the public, I'm really outdone by. And also for the global south, how is it sustainable if, how can you build a house or generate electricity if we are divesting from coal? One of the key ingredients is that you need to burn to make all these houses and electricity, but hope that is a good summation. Thank you.
I think it's a good summation, and I think taxation is a big issue. I've been involved in a number of projects where PPP programs are being initiated in countries, and however, it's not been done in isolation. It's been done with a focus on public finance management as well, to ensure that effective taxes are paid, that there aren't loopholes for people avoiding, because it's that very much that funding gap which is caused by a loss of tax or offshoring of tax commitments, etc., that results in governments not having the money to do the projects and then reaching out to PPPs. I think in an ideal world, if we had enough public funding, we wouldn't need PPPs because the government could just pay for it, and we don't have that. So it's important, but again, fair tax is critically important. I agree with you. It's also careful that if you're going to have taxation and you are going to pay subsidies to companies that are running PPPs, to ensure that this doesn't take away the financial, commercial, economic sustainability of the project, because they become too reliant on handouts. And then just only one thing that I did want to comment on is, when we talk about PPPs, I wouldn't say that PPPs, we have to have a clear definition of PPPs when it comes to privatization, because as soon as you privatize it, you don't have a public-private partnership anymore. You've just privatized it. I think it's, outsourcing is a term of services which is more interesting or more accurate, but that's a big debate, and that's a hot word. Many countries, when I go in, they say, oh, you're going to privatize national assets, state assets, and you're giving it away to the private sector. I think PFPs are against, vehemently are opposed to that, and ensuring that everything is done in the interest of the country and its people. I think we're almost out of time, so I don't know.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Cecilia, I don't know if before we move on.
We take one last question. If Jeffrey, you want to ask the question and we close it. I know many questions are still remaining. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and we hope you keep the conversation going. We do have a LinkedIn group. If you wanted to, contact with David, feel free to connect with him. Jeffrey, last question.
Hi, thank you, David. Thank you for such a stimulating presentation. I'm an architect and urban designer, and one of the things that we are focusing on is net zero carbon projects to meet the aspirational goals of cities and regions in the United States. And of course, with the Biden administration coming in, there's this increased urgency to roll out this infrastructure to scale. So hence the opportunity for public-private partnerships and to build capacity within those financing entities to actually address these emerging technologies that they typically were not they're not really well trained necessarily to know much about return on investment and those kinds of issues having to do with these emerging technologies. So one of my, I guess, really two quick related questions. So regarding the Biden administration's infrastructure financing to meet 2050 net zero carbon goals, which types of zero carbon projects do you think would be most suited to PPPs? Would it be EV infrastructure, energy storage, retrofitting building envelopes, on-site energy generation, those kinds of things? In other words, would there be certain sectors that the financing entities would be most attracted to? And then kind of related is the actual implementation of these, which cut across jurisdictional limits from city to regional to state, and also getting sort of dealing with the sort of 4-year electoral cycles in the United States, where there's not that much incentive from elected officials to put the investments in for something that's going to be a longer return. So I was just curious, would things like federal block grants be a good incentive to bake in the sort of carrot and stick requirements for MOUs between, say, jurisdictions, or to address the kind of larger focus kind of that goes beyond the 4 years? Because that was rolled out during the Obama administration in the sustainable communities grants that were not only municipal, but also regional in scale, and MOUs had to be written for those.
Yeah, thank you. I think we suffer from pendulum whiplash every 4 years or every 8 years, where, I've worked on federal projects where we've written our policy and that, then the next administration comes in and we just throw the manual out the window and start again. I think if, you can do people first PPPs that prove that they are valuable and work, that I think a lot of this will be retained, especially when it comes to future proofing, sustainability, etc. But one of the big challenges, is the whole idea of, governments call for and they say they support these type of green initiatives, etc. And that, but then when the contracting officers come along and they evaluate the projects, some of these projects are going to be, pricier, because when you do carbon credits, etc., it's got to be paid for somehow. And then they disqualify that company because, the idea was great and the innovative idea was great, but there was another company that wasn't offering as much and it was cheaper. So I think we have to, focus on putting our, if the government under Biden is really going to look at these type of projects and is going to promote them, it has to create the understanding with the procurement officers, the procurement processes, the procurement process approaches, that this is truly valued and scores higher so that it gets considered. So I don't know if that answers, but I think we're out of time anyway. So I would just like to thank everyone. Please reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I love talking. My wife says I talk too much about PPPs, but Erjan knows that I live, eat, sleep, dream, talk, walk, and do everything that you can about PPPs. And I really should get a life, but whether that's right or wrong, fantastical or practical, having these conversations, I think, always creates a situation where people learn ideas, hear things. And if you haven't considered it, consider joining WAPPP. It's a wonderful forum. It's a nonprofit. It has no agenda other than just trying to get people to talk on that. And, we would welcome you and look forward to having these debates to continue. Thank you.
Thank you. To continue the conversation, actually, I copied the questions and I will post them on our LinkedIn page.
Okay.
If anyone wants to keep talking. Thank you, David, very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.